Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you an experiment I've been working on that is based off a couple of concepts I've been really exploring this summer, and I wanted to see what you thought. Fundamentally, the experiment is about what level of pattern versus complexity really makes something beautiful. So a little while ago, I would have posted a video about how one way to achieve beauty, at least in design, is to work with patterns, and one way to understand patterns is through symmetry. But what I said in there very quickly was that perfect patterns or something that are too simple is not necessarily beautiful. You do have to have a certain level of complexity and interest, maybe even imperfection, to get something truly beautiful. That said, I think if you go too far, it becomes ugly, for lack of a better word, again. And so what I wanted to try to do is like create a series of drawings that really explored pattern from very simple through more and more complex, more and more irregular, to see if there's sort of a sweet spot that is beautiful. And I'll show you these drawings and you can comment what your thoughts are and if you sort of agree or not. And I might post in the description below a couple videos that might be relevant to the basic concepts I'm talking about here, but you might just enjoy this video as is. And the other thing I want to say is when I say patterns can be from symmetries, I don't necessarily mean mirror symmetry. There's a lot of various kinds of symmetry, so I'll talk a little bit about that in the drawings as well. So let's jump in and see what I did.
All right, so here's my first drawing. Very simple. It's just a line. That's just my starting geometry. All other transformations or patterns or symmetries that I make sort of start off just a very simple line that's horizontal. And so the simplest thing I can do from there is just copy this downward. So copy sort of a transformation. It's technically called a symmetry, especially when it's so even like this. And is this set of horizontal lines more interesting to look at, and I would argue more beautiful than the previous image? It certainly is. Is it spectacular yet? No. So let's go through a couple more transformations on these and see what we can do. So one thing that I've done here is what I did is I just put in a little random code, and I have the same number of lines. I've just randomly put them in the vertical setting. So some are further spaced, some are closer, and the thick ones are actually just because some of the lines are touching each other, and they sort of go into one thick line. Well, is this more interesting than the other one with a little bit of complexity? Perhaps, although I still don't think it goes very far. Um, I think this one we start to get someplace. And so here I have also put in a transformation to scale, meaning make bigger or smaller the lines. That is a symmetry. It is a transformation. And I think that level of complexity is here. This is a pattern of horizontal lines. It has transformations that move it and copy it down and scale it larger or smaller. Those are all symmetries, and it's more complex. And certainly at this point, I think this set of drawings is clearly starting to get more interesting than the early set of drawings. But we can still look at a lot more and see what happens. So in this one, I've taken the same lines basically, and I've just done the same sort of things, but I added a random rotation. So I kept the start point on the left-hand side the same, but then I've rotated the lines. And I think this is more interesting, but again, a little bit more complexity. Still pattern. Rotation is another kind of symmetry. There's a mathematical equation that just sets how different scaled objects and different rotations relate to each other. And I think it makes it more interesting, more beautiful, and more complex with that little bit of randomness. Now here what I've done is I've actually changed it so that these lines could be anywhere on the screen. So before I had it set there, the left-hand column was justified. Now I've sort of exploded it all over the place to see what happens and add another bit of interest, complexity, and randomness into it. Now in this case, I do think this is very interesting. When you look at it holistically with the last one big difference is there's a difference in density here. This density is a lot less. I think that balance of black to white has been reduced, and so I think there's another issue that deals with visual interest there that we're not quite capturing. But I'm going to show some alternatives at the end. I'll get back to the density question. For now, I wanted to keep the line count the same for this set of studies, but I still have several more in this series just to get through. I think this is very interesting. The question is it more interesting than the previous one? Here, I've done the same thing. Again, it's the same set of equations. The thing I added to it is line thicknesses. So the line thicknesses could get thicker, and At this point in this slide transition, it was certainly was clear that the lines moved, and I should mention I'm running the same script every time. That script has a lot of these features that are sort of randomized, and so every time I run it, the lines become randomized. The same number of lines, I kept that consistent, but their placement, their rotation, and so on and so forth are randomized as it goes through each slide. So I see a little jump, but fundamentally it's the same mathematics, it's the same pattern that's making all of these. So does adding line thicknesses to this make it more interesting? I think it does. Then I can actually start to change some colors, which I think at this point in the slides, we're starting to get up to almost the peak interest, the peak beauty of this set of patterns. I've added some color. There's line thickness, rotation. So again, I have lots of videos on color theory and how color theory is really just about patterns and symmetry as well. Again, not mirror symmetry, but other kinds of symmetry and said mathematical symmetry, if you will. So this is really interesting. And I took the color idea one step further, and I actually allowed this one to be any color possible. It's all, again, it's based on some random randomizing code, so it can select different colors. It's sort of fun. I think this is about as good. Some people, I would guess, probably think this one might look more interesting than the previous one. Some people might think the last one looks more interesting than this one. I do think we're sort of reaching that peak of where there's enough pattern in here and there's not enough recognizable form that's in across all the lines to make it interesting and beautiful and complex enough to be visually interesting and beautiful, but starting to come to the point where maybe we're getting close to adding too much that it starts to go down the other side where there's too much there. The complexity of the pattern is letting the pattern be lost and becoming less interesting. So we'll keep going through a few more and see if that happens, and see if you agree with that. So in this one, it's the same as the last one, except for I allowed lines to be dashed, and I've allowed those dashed lines to be various levels of thickness as well. So you can see that in there. Now it's very similar to the last one, but a little bit more complexity in there. And then in this one, it sort of really, I think, jumps up in complexity. It's still based off that same line. I've just added points along that line and allowed that line to vary from those points, right? So it turns the lines into the zigzags, but it's obviously a much more complex line, and I would start to argue at this point we were really clearly in the case where it's just becoming too chaotic to be interesting. Now, not saying that zigzag lines can't be beautiful; they can be, but when you do the scale, line weight, color, dashes, and all these things on top of it, they add up. I could have run this in a different way. I could have put zigzags in earlier, maybe with only black lines, and it would have looked fine there when I sort of limited it. So really, these slides could have been the transformations I applied could have been in any order, but this is the order that I happen to do them in. And I think it's starting to get more complex, but I could still add complexity to this to really see where it goes. So in this one, it's sort of fun because what I did is I just basically took some lines that are zigzagged, and then I took some of them ones that became zigzagged. I said also make them not hard edges, but soft edges, sort of curvy edges. So you can see there's some straight lines, there's some curvy lines, there's some sharp angled lines. Some are dotted, some are not. Different line thicknesses and stuff. And so we can see what it looks like. I don't know if it really produces that much of a difference from the last one, but it's still, I think, sort of overly complex from some of that peak beauty that some was there in the other slides. And then this one, I just used Illustrator to say, hey, put some fill on it. Some of the objects are filled with color and some aren't. Again, just to add some more complexity. And again, so we're getting really crazy. Now, again, I'm really looking at this lens to the beauty of pattern and beauty. That's not to say there aren't other kinds of beauty. So certainly there are appropriate times to be overly complex and sort of very colorful. And if that's your goal, there are other, if it's an intellectual goal or that can get you to beauty, which is the case, or some sort of thematic goal that gets you to beauty, which is also another way there, then something like this you might find really beautiful because it's certainly interesting. I think, but I think it's almost too chaotic to just sort of like really capture your attention as some of the other slides did. And then lastly, I just threw on some randomness for transparency to take that, adding the fill, I think really took it in a different direction. So how can I make a complexity out of that fill a little bit more? So I even think, certainly this one is not as nice as the previous one. Even if you thought that adding fill helped, that's a simple sort of change, arguably, and if I made that more complex, I can become over that little peak, if you will. So that is that one. So actually, here's the slide I'm showing where I show them all. I don't show the first single line, but I'm showing them all. And so I made the argument that these two over here were sort of at the peak of complexity, from the most simple, straightforward line um, to sort of a most interesting, most visually interesting, to almost being too complex down in here to be as beautiful. Again, these were done based on mathematical formula, so they basically created patterns. Those patterns are symmetries, because if you copy something and move it, that's a symmetry. If you rotate something, that's a symmetry. If you scale something, that's a symmetry. So those fundamental transformations are the core to creating patterns. And patterns, I do think, make beautiful things. But again, things that are too simple, they're beautiful, but they could potentially be more beautiful. Things that are too complex, they might be beautiful, but there might be ways of doing something more beautiful. And I think there's a sweet spot of creating a richness of pattern that has a certain complexity, even an imperfection to it, that is the most beautiful. At least, again, it's one approach when we're just sort of filling it down to sort of a design and patterns approach to understanding beauty, as I am in this video. So anyway, the big question is, do you agree with me? Do you think pattern is a good way to beauty? Do you think what I think the sort of the peak complexity is a peak, or do you like something else? Do you like simple things? Do you like very complex things, or do you have any other thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. I'm actually going to show you a few more fun things I did with the script in Illustrator. So I basically just took the middle zone that we just looked at, and I upped the number of lines that were drawn by the script to get a higher density, because there is that sort of, I talked about how there, when just doing with single lines, there has a certain density, and when I explode it over the whole slide, it has a different density, and I like more density. I think that complexity is interesting, so I wanted to see what happened if I added it. And I mean, I think all these shapes are really, really interesting to look at, and I potentially think this could be used for other renderings. Obviously, on this channel, I show a lot, mostly about how to make architectural renderings, and my long-term goal is to maybe start using some fun stuff like this in architectural rendering. But I'm not there yet. Maybe, hopefully, someday those videos will be up here. But super fun, and I do think adding that density makes that script better. Like, it improves what we saw from the last slide. And then what I did is I tried just tweak the code a little bit, just to see what I could see what I could change, just to produce interesting things. So I just wanted to share that really quickly. Here, it's basically a lot of the same transformations or symmetries I made in terms of starting with a line, scaling it, rotating it as well. The only difference I did is I started one line at the end point of the previous line, so it would create sort of a unified, it'd create one line, sort of tweaking it. And the other thing is, in rotation, I really limited the amount of the rotation could be. So it looked at the previous rotation and said, okay, do a rotation like that. So that's why you get the swirls around, because it's rotating about itself in a similar sort of direction. And then I can tweak this too. So here I actually just opened up what, actually, I think on the previous slide I used a consistent rotation for. And then this one I said, okay, now open up that rotation just a little bit, make it a little more randomized to see what happens, produces sort of an interesting result. And then I just threw in a couple other things here. I just said, okay, well, now put a different color on all the different line segments, and then potentially use a dash dot pattern on some of them as well. It sort of creates a sort of interesting sort of geometry and allows me to sort of control these lines. Again, I think in drawing and rendering, there might be fun ways of using it. And then I just did one more quick experiment with the script, because this was sort of easy for me to make this transformation of, as I just turned lines into circles and just sort of put everything on there and said, okay, what would you do? And I think, again, it sort of creates something really interesting that could potentially be useful for any. Yeah, so that, I think, is the end of this video. So let me know what you think, and keep making great drawings. Thanks for watching.